Okay, so here we are, episode 3 of the CERES Podcast, and for this episode, we have a special guest on. So this is Dr. Gerry Quinn, and he's a microbiologist and an immunologist. He got his PhD in the University of Ulster in what was it in? You're in
Biomedical science.
biomedical sciences. So Jerry started collaborating with us on a number of papers a few years ago, and before COVID, and then when COVID came along, we started working on some papers as well. And so the last month, Jerry has gotten his own paper working on his research published. That it's been a long time, and there's also been a group paper that on the COVID-19 policies, and this is quite a big paper. We're going to kind of do a special episode here on these two projects, and so we invited Jerry in to see if he can introduce a little bit about this. And so I don't know, should we start the just okay, let's get into it. Okay, so Jerry, I think we can start with you have this quite fascinating uh, body of work that you've been working on, um, looking at identifying antibiotics and different antiviral. Well, I'll let you talk about it, but should we start off with maybe you can give us a bit of an overview of what you've found on this latest paper that you got published in the Journal of Religion and Health, and I think you also got a separate essay in the microbiologist, which is
Yeah,
on a similar thing, is it?
yeah.
So
The,
okay,
micro, the microbiologist is a journal of the Applied Microbiology Society. Actually, the title of the manuscript, "The Blessed Clay from Boho, Northern Ireland: Can the nature of spiritual healing sites guide us towards new sources of drug discovery?" That actually took 1 year to be published. And therefore, in the intervening period, I managed to come up with some new thoughts on, to explain in easier English or easier understanding to more of a non-scientific audience, what I was trying to get at, because it's not a strictly biochemical study. And I've obviously shied away from talking about the spiritual and cultural aspects of some of my discoveries because they do exist in an environment. But by ignoring them, we reduce some of the information. So that's why I put something out in the microbiologist as well. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, the cultural and spiritual context surrounding some of these discoveries is really important to understand perhaps some of the biochemistry. So my current field of interest, as Ronan said, is in Streptomyces, and Streptomyces produces antibiotics. Actually, Streptomyces is responsible for probably greater than 80% of known antibiotics. And also, it produces antiviral, antifungal, anti-cancer, and anti-parasitic compounds. So I've been involved in that field for more than 10 years. So the reason that people are interested in Streptomyces specifically, although they produce a lot of the current antibiotics, is because that we're running out of antibiotics and we're trying to find more and new sources of antibiotics. And the reason for this also is because there's a rise in antimicrobial resistance. I was explaining to Ronan yesterday that antimicrobial resistance arises from the constant use of supposedly they say antimicrobial resistance arises because of the constant use of antibiotics, but actually, uh, antimicrobial resistance has been around since antibiotics have evolved, because the organism has to have a mechanism to reduce the toxicity of antibiotics on its own system. So they've always been around, but I was I was thinking about it last night. We actually use a disproportionate concentration of these single molecules. So in nature, you find the concentration of antibiotics at a certain concentration, but we've taken them out of their environment where they're surrounded by other control molecules, and now we use them kind of out of place of the natural environment. So maybe that is also partially responsible for antimicrobial resistance. So there's been a real flurry of searching for new antibiotics, and it was thought that maybe the chemical industry could solve this problem by just synthesizing many varieties of current antibiotics from the core template. And we had more than a decade of this kind of trial and error. But what they found out was that many of these compounds hadn't been seen in the natural environment before, so they weren't stable, or sometimes they were too toxic, and the amount of investment that drug companies had to put into this uh, was far outweighed by the lack of success. They only had two or three candidates in something like 15 years. So, a lot of drug companies pulled out because that search for new antibiotics wasn't it wasn't really worth the money. Uh, but this was kind of rescued by advances in genome sequencing. But they found that when they sampled maybe some soil from a desert, or some sample from an ice field, that actually there was also bacteria there, and previously in places where you didn't think bacteria grew, they were sampling, and so they isolated some of these organisms, and some of these organisms were Streptomyces. So this is one of the new fields looking for Streptomyces in unusual.
Right, even in ice cloud, by the way.
Yeah, even in clouds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can take a very small amount and amplify the DNA and say what was originally there. Okay. Yeah, this is actually an image of Streptomyces growing on an agar plate,
Mhm.
and commonly they're used for many different types of antibiotics over the years since
Mm.
1940. Okay.
Uh,
But as I said, we've begun to see new sources of antibiotics, including unusual places, and
I, I,
uh, and
I just saw that there was one of those that you mentioned. If you go back to that slide,
okay, yeah,
and just the second one down there is
Ivermectin.
ivermectin, which we
the
will maybe
antiparasitic
talk.
discovered on our golf course
Yeah,
by the
In Japan,
yeah
Tokyo.
yeah, we
yes
may be talking about that in the later
yeah
half.
that one got the Nobel Prize for this discovery, and for its humanitarian action of relieving some
Mhm.
river blindness in Africa.
No.
Yeah, that was a great discovery.
Okay, sorry to interrupt there.
No,
Okay,
that's okay. You have a very keen eye. So as well as extreme areas, the researchers started to discover that Streptomyces was also associated with different species. So they didn't expect the act to be growing on the outside. This is a leaf cutter ant, and it's growing, and the ant actually uses this Streptomyces to farm. Well, that's what the researchers think, to farm in its garden to keep some of the fungus down.
Wow.
okay,
So my boss at the time, Paul Dyson, in the University of Swansea, was looking in some of these extreme areas and different species to look for new species of Streptomyces which we could isolate new antibiotics for. And then I proposed that the area I used to live in Boho, Fermanagh, which
Mhm.
has which has the soil there has a high pH because of the limestone rock, I proposed that we should also look there for new species of Streptomyces because it's also a stressful environment for for growth of microorganisms as well.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was there, actually I didn't
What
actually.
was the hint? What was the hint? It's,
So I'm just going to say, I, I actually didn't
I
realize.
can check out my backyard. You know what I mean? Not coming
Yeah.
here.
I didn't realize that there was a folk cure there already. I knew about many folk cures, but there was actually a folk cure that was commonly available. Okay, and people said, so while you're testing some of the soil, why don't you test this folk cure? Okay, and at the time, I think I was trying to get published, and I thought if I dig into something that's kind of folky and spiritual, then the chances of me getting published may be slimmer. But anyway, I done it just in case. And from that sample of soil, I discovered eight other species of Streptomyces. Okay, and then I tested these Streptomyces in a lab in Swansea, and they were one of them, or a couple of them, sorry, were effective against MRSA. And then I shifted jobs over to Croatia, and they gave me a whole bunch of pathogens, like clinical pathogens, not lab pathogens, but clinical. If you bring a pathogen into the lab and then subculture it loses its pathogenicity over time. Okay, it attenuates. But the hospital or associated with the hospital in Croatia, they gave me 37, I think it was, clinical strains, something like that. And some of my organisms done really well against these strains. Some of these are.
Can you say a little bit about what the actual the folk cure was?
Yes,
Because I'm curious
certainly,
about that.
certainly, Ronan. Sorry. The folk cure was. Let me go back to the church. The folk cure was actually some soil, okay, and
Yeah.
then you wrap the soil up in a cloth, and then you go home. You don't talk to anyone on the way. Sometimes some people used actually for toothache. They stuck the cloth in their mouth for a while. They went home and then they put it underneath their pillow. And
Hmm.
then in a couple of days they brought it back to the church. And also, while they were doing that, they said some prayers to various different for
What was
various different causes.
where was
So
the soil from?
obviously, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
obviously there will be an awful lot of auto-suggestion involved in
Good, good, good. I'm going to come on to that eventually, Michael.
yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to.
Uh,
I'm going to
what was the significance of that side of the soil? Why did people focus on that?
well,
Where was the soil?
okay. The soil belonged to an old priest's grave, and the old priest was a healer. Okay, and he emerged actually at the end of the persecution of religion, the penal laws in Ireland.
Okay.
But he picked up a lot of folk culture while he was saying his mass out in the fields or out in the hedges. And
Where- where-
he
yeah,
and
the-
he said before he died, because people got worried, he died actually quite old, but people got worried that there would be no main folk healer around. And he said, don't worry, the soil that will cover me will also cure the same things that it
Wow.
cured when when I was alive. Okay, so some people took that to mean the actual soil from his grave, okay, was curative. But the other interpretation could be the soil from around the area, the soil from the limestone mountain will
Mm-hmm.
also cure. But some people, they focused on his grave, the soil that will cover me, but the the soil that covered him was taken from the whole mountain. It didn't automatically stop one place, apart from the cliff. So
Well,
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. So no, that's interesting. I just on the penal laws because people not familiar with
yeah.
Irish.
I don't want to hash too much politics. So
No, no, but there was this a period where Catholics, in particular, were persecuted. But when was that? When was that period? That would have been 1800s. What?
no, it stopped. It's yeah. It stopped around 18. So I mean, meant to have stopped at around 1815 or something, or
Okay.
somewhere around then. But
Yeah,
there was a transition period where they said, no, we're not doing it anymore. But some people were still, they had people that would hunt down the priest or something and say, you're not official. And then you either have to leave or face prison or something like that.
Mhm.
there was an awful lot of the penal laws. One of the things, for example, was that a Catholic wasn't allowed to have more than £5 worth of assets, and if he had a horse worth more than £5, then someone of a different religion could just take
Protestant, but yeah,
it.
the
Yeah,
Anglican or like
I don't want to get into us, these, them, or whatever
yeah.
these
Yeah. Okay.
are.
Let's get back to some.
But just to give people a context of because most people, I a lot of people wouldn't know the Irish history. So he was when did he pass away in
I
early
think it was like
1800s?
I'm not really sure, 1812 or something. Don't quote me on it. Then
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sounds good. So let's keep going.
Okay, but it was from this. I mean that paper came out in I think 2018 November. But then I was doing other experiments on that line, and the first part of the paper I published is actually I realized that there's many other sites of spiritual healing which have the same geology and the same geography as a particular site in Ireland, and most of these come from limestone environments. So there is a lot of reports, especially from caves, of streptomyces
It,
being
it
found.
is it is interesting that you bring that up because my grandmother lived in a place down in Clare, and most of the Clare area has a lot of limestone in it. But there was a holy well there that all the locals believed was good for curing skin disorders. So the idea was if you went to the well and washed yourself in this holy water, that it cured dermatitis, different types of.
I'll be down there to sample, Michael.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I kind of the idea when I published this thing in 2018, I I didn't give the cultural and the spiritual aspects of the discovery much airtime. I really cut my cloth really tight because I was publishing in a microbiology magazine, and I was like, that's a bit. It's not biochemistry, and I really don't think it will fly too much. And I was really spending a hard time with the reviewers as well because they weren't recognizing my new species. And we eventually ended up calling it a novel species rather than a new species. We were splitting hairs in the end. So anyway, from there, I kind of I developed some kind of theory that maybe all of these places that have a limestone environment are also rich in streptomyces. So I had some kind of, I was about a couple of years ago when I had a bit more time on my hands. I says I need to rectify my mistake and look into the cultural and the spiritual aspects of these discoveries. Because all scientific discoveries have a context around them, and I'd kind of done the same thing as the antibiotic explorers, just plucked the antibiotic out and ignored all the compounds around it, or ignored which field it was found in, or ignored the geology and says, we've got a new compound. So it all happens in a context. What they call today the metadata.
Yeah.
So
I would imagine actually the climatic zone, the Köppen climatic zone, would be a good what you call indicator because it depends on temperature, moisture, and geology. You think it's more geology related.
I
Well,
think
pH
no.
is a big pH is a big
The
thing.
thing about streptomyces is you find them in the Atacama Desert. in the, in
Wow.
the North Pole, in
Okay,
the
so it's
Antarctica, on the Tibetan Plateau, uh,
okay.
in a sponge, in a really deep sea, in a hot, in a, what they call them, a black smoker,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, all climatic zones. The Streptomyces supposedly diverged from their nearest ancestor about 350 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not. They have a really complicated genome, and they have lots of emergency capacity. They have a
Mm.
lot of emergency genome to adapt to
Yeah, to adapt to
many
any. Yeah.
situations. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, you even find them in Egyptian tombs from thousands of years ago, and then they revive them from Egyptian tombs or from the paintings on Egyptian tombs or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite a popular place. But also the Egyptian tombs, they covered them with plaster, and they love they love plaster because
Pasta,
it's calcium carbonate or
food, yeah,
calcium sulfate.
food.
Yeah. So it's gypsum. They like gypsum,
Gypsum,
calcium
yeah.
sulfate. Anyway, so I looked at other places around the world, and
It's actually interesting. It's just as an aside. It's interesting that there is a self-healing concrete in which they apply yogurts to the concrete when you're making it. Sometimes concrete cracks, and if you apply yogurts in to these cracks, then you get the bacteria will inhabit the cracks and then form calcium carbonate, which actually seals and
yeah,
kills the
yeah,
crack.
yeah.
So yeah.
So I examined other places around the world that had similar geographies. Limestone rock with a really thin covering of soil. So most people would be familiar with places like Lourdes or Medjugorje or Fatima from. But there's also other places in New Mexico, the Santuario de Chimayo, okay, or the Bom Jesus de Lapa in Brazil. Yeah, yeah. Well, even these kind of spiritual cure places extend right up to other places like the Netherlands and Belgium, where they use limestone dust in some of the cures. The limestone dust from Saint Gerlachus tomb in the Netherlands, and they say, "Oh, this is curative." Not because it's just limestone, but because supposedly it's associated with the saint's grave. You know.
Did I see you had a slide of one example there? If I when I
Let me see. Yeah, I jumped 10.
oh yeah, it'll take us down.
That's a mountain. Okay, yeah.
No, yeah. Well, this is actually the next theme, which is there's many religions built on top of each other on these sites. So they might be Christian, and previously there were some Abrahamic faith, and then previously before that. So the place at Boho, which was from the initial discovery, was built on top of supposedly built on top of a druid amphitheater. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'll go back a couple of slides because then
Mm-hmm.
okay, or one slide. And this is near some Neolithic stones that are supposedly around 4,000 years old, although they haven't been properly dated.
Dated.
Okay, and these would contain like ceremonial markings called cup and ring. Okay, and they've been there for. So it's not. I doubt if it's coincidence that these seven sacred stones are so close to the original place. You
Yeah.
know, but also places like. The bottom of Mount Sinai. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is a Christian site, the St. Catherine's Monastery, but obviously previously this is supposedly where the Ten Commandments were given or came down from, and
Mm-hmm.
previously from that, the desert religions used to use this site as well. So what I think is there has been a continuity of knowledge of some kind of there's a continuity of understanding that something in the soil or in the water has healing properties, and they ascribe it to the religion because healing comes from the from their spirituality. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so
Or you could, if you could look at it the other way, and that the healing powers may come from something about the place as well. So I guess that's kind of where you're hinting at this spirituality
oh
uh,
well, this
side.
is this is the second half of the manuscript. So the easy part of the manuscript is saying, okay, it's a limestone area. It has a certain geology, and this is more likely to have some streptomyces which have healing compounds. That's the easy part. Okay, the harder part is saying, okay, so what do all these religions and traditions have in common, and what can that say about the cures that they are purporting to have? Okay, so that was the other half of the research, which is still a work in progress.
So how are you going to distinguish this from placebo type effects?
No, I'm coming to that, Michael. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah. That's you're ahead of the game, or you're behind the game, should I say? Okay, and that actually is the point that I was coming to. Okay, so one of the themes from these areas is a strong belief system, you know. So in many places, these spiritual sites are a lot of the indigenous population, because the soil is very thin, should I say. It leads to poverty and poor farmers, but that means in a lot of cases they have very strong beliefs. Okay, so, and this is what I was coming to about the placebo effect, because all drugs, when they're tested, they have a placebo control, and that's to test if even just the thought of the drug alone, even though it's not the drug, is enough to help people to be cured. But that is also that is also a positive thing if the cure is not that effective. But if you have a positive mindset, but that is something that's been known for thousands of years.
Within
Maybe
engineering, it
maybe
would be
not,
called positive
maybe,
feedback.
maybe not acknowledged, but it's known. Okay.
I think that's something we may return to later, because I think that's been kind of lost in a kind of the what caused some problems, say during the COVID pandemic, where people were focusing on specific the medications and the activity, and rather the people's lifestyle, and even the emotional states that people were in. There's I think there seems to have been problems with like the actual fear. When people are in a state of fear, that that can
Oh yeah,
cause
no, a
problems.
state of fear
Well,
depresses the immune system, and
Then,
what
yeah,
this
so
let,
placebo effects can be positive or negative,
Yeah.
So
let me
okay.
I just want to add this point. But we know we actually know the physiological system that causes this upswing or downswing in immunity, and it's called the HPA axis, which is a hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which
mm,
was responsible for stress and immunity. So
Okay.
that's, I don't know, that discoveries in the last maybe 10, 20 years. So they know that a positive mindset will help you recover quicker. Actually, when Fleming discovered penicillin, he said this antibiotic is not going to wipe out infection. You need a functioning immunity to help mop
mm-hmm.
up the last of the infection. The antibiotics don't do it all. So maybe it's a cross. It's a it's a lesson from something that was already ignored but not acknowledged. So one of the differences between these cures and obviously medicines is that the cure is also meant to benefit the spiritual life, the spiritual life of the spirit of the person. Okay. And therefore, it's common amongst many of these traditions to emphasize something kind of that we were talking about, holistic healing, as in the healing of the mind, the body, and the spirit. I think there was a part in the Bible that Jesus said to the person, "Go away and sin no more," and he healed them. And most people say, what is that about? But it's also that digs into the part of healing the mind, the body, and the spirit. We part of these medicines is, I mean, I'm exploring them because they're unknown, but part of them digs into the mystic, the mystical side, which is the mystical unknown. So we don't necessarily, like, nobody 1,000 years ago knew there was any Streptomyces hanging around producing antibiotic, but they knew there was something, and nobody thought, well, if I just focus on this prayer, that I might be better. Nobody, they trusted in some unknown, but where I am trying to investigate this unknown. I'm not trying to demystify the whole thing. There's many mysteries, but I'm just trying to one step at a time to see if there's any basis in my science to understand these phenomena better. Okay. So yes, just the last thing then, maybe the last thing about the holistic approach. So in the beginning, I was saying that it was amazing when Fleming discovered his antibiotic. It was an amazing. Although they had antibiotics before, there was some kind of toxic side effects, but this was one of the first one that was like wipe out the infection and everything would be okay.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be so many toxic side effects of aniline dyes or whatever it is. It was completely amazing, but Fleming and the Streptomyces person that followed that discovered streptomycin, which cured TB. They pulled out the active ingredient from its natural environment. It could have been surrounded by many compounds. So the most recent research concentrates on compounds that surround the active ingredient. Okay, and what they've shown in the last couple of years is that these compounds help the efficiency of the actual antibiotic. Okay, they help with the penetration of the antibiotic. They help reduce the emergence of antimicrobial resistance. So
Mm.
there's a new movement in modern science to incorporate some of these. They're called other secondary metabolites. So to incorporate some of these other secondary metabolites into modern medicines. So some of them are even like things like biosurfactants, which will help the permeability of cells and help the active ingredient permeate into maybe the bacteria or the viral membrane or something. So that's something we've adapted, but the original cures were a holistic preparation. They didn't use one compound. They usually used a mixture of this and that, to make a the healing substance. I don't have it written down, but I just wanted to say that the context of the discovery should never be thrown out, and we can use that to understand. Even though we think it's ridiculous, superstitious, whatever, we're just labeling it, and we should always keep it.
Back when I was young in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of books written on the power of positive thinking, and that sort of thing, which is saying that if you have a positive outlook, you can get better or heal yourself, or so on. So what you're saying there is, if these cures actually have some sort of effect, that it can be enhanced by the person getting positive feedback and saying, "Oh, this is making me better," and so
Yeah.
you have
Well,
to look at the social
what
aspect.
I'm saying is there's many roads to healing,
Yes.
and many combined roads to healing. And we shouldn't have a one fits all solution.
I think people might. So we'll move on to the next thing in a bit. But people might be saying, "Oh, you've discovered a new antibiotic. This must be yeah. You must be loaded at this stage.
Loaded with cash.
How much? How many Ferraris and Lamborghinis have you gotten from your discovery,
Such a
Gerry?"
hard work, yeah.
How much research money have I raised? I think I think I raised a couple of hundred on on a drive to get some organism sequence, because we didn't. I went over this mountain again and picked up another couple of organisms, and in total it had like antiviral, antifungal, antibiotic, anti-cancer compounds. We haven't isolated all the compounds individually because we didn't have any funding for it. So if I discovered a really great antibiotic, then when you have an infection in the hospital or something, the policy is to reach for the cheapest, most effective drug first. Okay, so ampicillin, penicillin, something like that. Okay, because you don't want to create antibiotic resistance to the top of the shelf. So then they have a pyramid of antibiotics. Okay, so when they get like 3 or 4 layers before they get to the top, most specialists, we can't do that. This kills everything. Okay, but you don't want any resistance to arise to that. It used to be something like vancomycin or daptomycin, but there's other new ones above this, but they are very rarely used. Not vancomycin, but the latest ones, they're very rarely used, and therefore there's zero there's zero profit in them. There's zero money, and the the drug companies really want you to bring your drug through all the phase trials, and then they might take it off you. But they make their money from the ordinary antibiotics, penicillin, ampicillin, erythromycin, stuff like that. So the answer is zero. I do this because I'm super interested in what's happening. I see the knowledge of this folk tradition is disappearing fast because it's an oral tradition, and I can only find out information from the older people, and they're leaving this world. So it's very hard to get, and also it's very hard to get to people of the older generation that agree to what they actually did, and how they actually operated these cures.
Let's go on to the next thing, which is this new paper that all four of us are co-authors, and it was just published in the International Journal of Public Health, and this is what lessons can be learned from the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see Gerry and myself are the top two authors there. But what's striking about this is that there's um, 37 co-authors, and from 13 countries, from 3 continents. So we have Europe, we have North America, and South America. And there's actually a lot of other researchers from around the world, from Australia, from Asia, from Africa, that also were giving us feedback as well while we were preparing this manuscript. And so I don't know, Gerry, do you want to talk a little bit about the genesis of this paper?
Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe the next slide should be shown, Ron.
Oh yeah, okay. Do you want to show the next slide first of all? Just the practicalities on this. So, as I said, 37 co-authors, 13 countries, more than 400 references. Oh, and just people might not be aware that this journal, the International Journal of Public Health, uh, it's it evolved from a Swiss journal, and the Swiss journal is a European journal on public health, but the original paper or journal was founded in 1921, so more than 100 years ago. So it has a very prestigious, long history going back. And so, as you've highlighted there on the slide, unlike prior assessments that focus narrowly on one or two aspects, this review uniquely integrates perspectives from many disciplines, including immunologists, including Gerry there, epidemiologists, virologists, data analysts, economists, research methodologists, psychologists, medical doctors, social scientists, and many more. Like this is. You'll hear just comment on this before I hand it back to you there, Gerry. But um, you would it, this was a problem from the very beginning with COVID was if somebody commented on, say, the school closures and they were looking at the things, they would say, "You're not a virologist." I was like, but they are somebody dealing with the problems in the elderly healthcare, because this was a lot of people were focusing on trying to extend the lives of those in the elderly healthcare by protecting them from their family and friends. But it's like the that they may have extended by a few months the length of their lives, but in a lot of cases it was a much, it might have been happier if they had actually had the chance to say goodbye to their families and friends, and likewise. So but people who would comment on a particular aspect or the economic impacts or the psychological impacts, they would be criticized because, oh, you're not this thing, you're not a virologist, you're not an epidemiologist. Meanwhile, epidemiologists wouldn't be able to comment on the thing. So one of the key things of this paper was that we felt it was important to incorporate the expertise and experience of people from cross disciplines. Back to you, Jerry, if you wanted to.
No, that's it's a very necessary introduction, Ronan, because it was a very serious subject, and the governments around the world seem to say that we know, which wasn't really the case. And I can remember when it kind of trickled in from from China to Italy to where I was in Northern Ireland. I definitely tried to ignore it. I listened to some reports, and they were quite confusing, because I used to work alongside other people in Florida. I worked on pathogenic infectious diseases, deadly ones, and my colleagues worked on HIV research, and some of the precautions that the government, I was like, we didn't even do this in the HIV lab. And some of them seemed really, the logic seemed contradictory, and yeah, I kind of kept it to myself. I was like, am I did I do the right immunology training? Do I know the latest findings? Because some of the videos that were coming in from China showed people shaking and then they'd fall to the ground and then die, and I was like, wow, that doesn't look like any disease I know, apart from maybe something like Wales disease from Leptospira, and that's a bacteria. It's not a virus, and it's not a lung infection. It's like rat bite fever, and I was I was like, this is really weird because other types of respiratory disease don't act like that. Well, first of all, it affects your breathing first. That's why it's called severe disease, acute respiratory disease. It's not severe somatic, it's acute respiratory disease. And there was none of them like huffing and puffing. They were all like they all had spasms and tremors, So I was like, this is baffling. I don't even know what this is. So I was relying on government experts or just reports from the media to tell me what was happening. Uh,
I think one of the things that we emphasize in the paper is that governments were using very small amounts of science with very limited experience to act as their advisors. I can remember here in Ireland, there was only two, maybe three people that were actually giving the advice to the government, and their fields of expertise was very narrow. Not realizing the implications within other fields.
In particular, we discuss in the paper. It's like one of the four sections is on the modeling, particularly in the first year, and even in the second year and third year, most of the assessments were being done based on these SEER models, SEIR models, and the there's no biology, there's no very little understanding. epidemiology or even in those models, let alone talking about economics or psychology or all the things we were talking about before about like lifestyle choices and in the previous part of the section of the podcast where we were talking about how when people are in fear that their immune system is weakened and so that actually can make them more vulnerable, but like there was we took touch on the paper on how there was even nudge units uh,
Ah, yeah, I
that
forgot.
we're actually trying to promote fear in order to create compliance or to
Correct.
make people to take things very seriously. Oh, I should mention that in terms of seriousness, Michael and I we got like COVID in March 2020.
We were in the first dozen in Ireland to get it.
Yeah, and we were at an event that was going on before in the last week before they restricted the events, and most of the attendees that were at that came down with a influenza-like illness that was quite severe, particularly for the older ones, that was
Uh,
unusual.
from my point of view, I lost 2.5 stone in 3 weeks. I was thinking of patenting the COVID as a weight loss system.
Yeah. But it is serious. We had like friends, like one of them, he had developed long COVID, and was struggling with that, and he passed away last year. And it's like this is the problem. Whenever you start to talk about COVID-19 and start having questions about policies, you're going to get two people, you get one group of people that will say it's all fake, it's all a scam, there was no pandemic, the virus doesn't exist, it's all there. And then you get the other people saying, oh, you don't know how serious this was. The reality is that it is a serious virus, it's a serious illness, but it's particularly bad among the elderly are at higher risk, and also particular high obesity, and so there's a very clear risk profile associated with the
And
disease.
that's known very, very, very
It,
early on.
it was obvious within a few months. It was
Yeah.
even clear from the before it had
And
left.
in actual fact, Amelda, my wife, was the first person to record that you lost your sense of taste when you got
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
virus.
this is in March 2020. So it is I think that's important for people to remember or be aware of. And it like obviously there's going to be people in
Yeah,
the comments who will be saying on one hand, oh, there is no virus, it's all no pandemic, it's all fake, you're imagining it. And then at the other hand, you're going to have people that are saying, no, don't belittle it. It was serious. It's
I
true.
think now we
the
should
other thing
let
about
Jerry
all
explain the history of the paper and of course a bit of a
Yes,
motivation.
yes, no, I welcome those interjections by you, Ronan. Because it's all about me. Uh, but no, no, I did take it very seriously, and I started from my own background. I knew that a virus that mutates. There was a suggestion that they should create some kind of vaccine, but I knew from my days in the HIV lab in Florida that making vaccines to mRNA viruses was just like or single strand viruses was it's kind of a waste of time because they mutate so fast. So what I was doing at that time, because I'm into Streptomyces, was Streptomyces also produce a lot of antiviral compounds. So what I was doing was investigating how many antiviral compounds there were in Streptomyces, so that they may maybe come in and alleviate some of the uptake, because actually it took about 8 months before the vaccines were rolled out. So the intervening period, the official advice was to do nothing and just treat the inflammation. So I know some physicians started off with some other compounds, and then I discovered that a lady in Australia, Kylie Wagstaff, had discovered the ivermectin, which they used as an antiparasitic, already had an effect against the SARS-CoV-2, and it created a 5,000 time reduction after 48 hours of one dose. And I was like, she beat me to it. She discovered the golden calf, and I was very happy for her, because I thought, oh, people will pick that up, and will alleviate, because that medicine has been out for 40 years, and it's got a great safety record, and it won a Nobel Prize and stuff. So but I continued on with my research. But with these lockdowns, I think that I get thrown out of my lab. So I had to seek other employment. And then I started working in a plastic factory that made breathing apparatus, because that got an exemption from the lockdown, and then I could earn some money to survive. But in the meantime, I was discussing with Ronan, how come that we're suggesting things about government policies that we think are not quite right. But if I was publishing a paper, I would be worried that other scientists would comment on all the mistakes that I was making. So why are no credible scientists commenting on government policy? And what I think we discovered was that it's not that they weren't commenting on government policy; it's that the news that they were commenting didn't come out, or they took 1 or 2 years for the information to travel through the peer review system, and then eventually. But by the time that complaint had come out, for instance, Simon Wood published a paper about the effect of the lockdowns in 2020, and he said they were already on their way down by the time the government introduced the lockdowns, and we can see no effect. But that paper wasn't published that year. It was delayed until the next year. So by the time he got the information out, it wasn't, well, actually, it was still quite good, because the government persisted in doing the same policy over again with much less information. So I think, we actually looked at Simon Wood's paper, and also noticed that, it was more like seasonality that was happening. But sorry, I jumped the gun. Previous to that, as Ronan was saying, there was two schools of scientific opinion. One was, look, it's an emergency. Let's just go along with the government advice. We think they're doing quite well. And the other school was like, no, we think this is a dangerous precedent for ethics, for truth in science, and for future policies. If we ignore some of the minutiae of the policies, we'll be accomplices in this kind of
Well,
uh,
well,
lie by omission,
yeah, but
or
there
exaggerate
was
statistics.
another thread that was going along, and it's probably best explained if we take the when the Omicron virus came out. Within a week of detecting the Omicron virus, Pfizer made 10 billion in profits in their shares just that
Nice,
one
nice.
week.
It's a
You
nice
know,
lift.
and to give an idea of Pfizer, Pfizer have hold the record, I think, for the largest fine for fraud. I think they were fined 2.3 billion in 2009 for fraudulently advertising a particular compound that didn't work.
Okay.
So before we get into the legacy of it at this stage, maybe you just explain a little bit about this. So what we do is we identify four main teams where we think that there was problems in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the paper, we stress that um, we recognize that other researchers disagree with us. if our opinions were already universally shared and understood, then we would not need to write this article. So that's a key bit. So the fact that we had to write this article and that we published it is saying that we think that there's information in this paper that is not widely known or that people would have considered. And so we say that therefore the reader should remember that we are presenting our scientific opinions and we do not claim to speak for the entire medical or scientific community. But
Yeah.
these are
Okay.
scientific opinions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. So I'll fast forward to the manuscript then. So we did publish another paper on seasonality, which we thought had a large influence on the pandemic. And that, but the fact that that took us 2 years, five journal submissions, and something like 12 or 13 reviewers told us that there may be some slowdown. And we thought, well, is it that we are particularly bad? But we came across other scientists as well who released articles like the unintended consequences, the inadvertent consequences, and we thought, they have to really, really pull their language, Uh, so we contacted them as well, and we said we have already published some information on the pandemic, and would you like to be part of this complete synthesis of where we think the health policy has diverged from the norm or from the previous accepted science, and do you think you can contribute? So we used our three previous publications on models, the inadvertent effects of government interventions, and also the seasonality paper to produce this manuscript.
we were noticing, like, I remember 2022 there was like this paper Bardash et al. Had been with quite high, was published in a high profile journal with quite high profile researchers, and they were pointing out that the vaccine mandates, and they get into the weeds of, was there a mandate? Basically, you'd have people will, if you even say there wasn't a mandate, there was restrictions based on your vaccine immunization status. People were restricted in their lives, in their what they could do based on their vaccination status, and some people, they were either, they had to be vaccinated to keep their jobs, or they were pressured, and so there was a lot of different pressure. So they did a paper looking at this and pointing out the ethical problems with it, and that it was causing downstream, causing major economic uh, problems, social problems, but also public health problems. But in that paper, they stressed that the vaccines actually were safe and effective, and they did this to put it in, and they were just talking about the mandates itself, and they didn't comment, they didn't say, well, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdowns, the mask, etc., that they were all fine. So they put in this caveat because they were criticizing one aspect of the science. And then you would find, we were finding other papers like, what was that one? Was it Mansuan Guan et
Oh,
al.?
Man
Yeah,
San Guan
Yeah, the
yeah.
Thai
from
group.
the Philippines.
I think it was Thailand, was it?
Thailand,
Oh,
yeah.
it was
Yeah,
Thailand. Okay, okay.
yeah, yeah. So they were looking at a high school in that was about to take their second Pfizer dose. All of the kids who were under 18, and they said, let's just uh, study the whole range. Just we'll monitor everything, cardiograms and all of this. Looking at everything before and after, and they found like what was it? Nearly
30%,
nearly
30%,
30%
nearly 30%. Yeah.
of the children, of the teenagers, had some
Cardia.
cardiovascular abnormality after taking the vaccine, and then that seven of them developed. Seven of the boys developed uh, pericarditis, myocarditis, or subclinical myocarditis.
And we should emphasize that this is a very rare effect in adolescents and young
Yes,
people.
yes.
It almost never occurs. Yeah.
But what struck us about it is that in the abstract and in the conclusions, they concluded by saying, but they all recovered and it was transient. It was
Same.
all everything, they're all much better immediately afterwards. And so this paper was being published that was showing something that should be a major alarm, that there was these things, and but they were only able to publish that it was very, a large number of children, like up to 30%, were having impacts, provided they could only get past the peer review gatekeepers if they put in, but they're
Put
all
in
better.
caveat.
And then you'd get people would be saying that say the myocarditis, and they would be conceding that this is occurring, but they would say it's very rare.
Very rare, yeah, unusual. Yeah.
So you would get these papers that would publish that would either say very rare, or they would say, but it's mild, but they would also put in, we're not disputing that they actually are working. They would put in they're effective. They would, and then you would
But
get others
the
publishing.
other thing was that right through the whole thing, the narrative kept on changing.
Yeah,
Like in the beginning, they were saying these vaccines are going to prevent you from getting the illness,
yeah,
and then when it didn't, they would say, well, it makes it less severe. And
yeah.
so each time their statement was contradicted, they changed the goalpost.
Yeah, but I guess because we're putting this on YouTube, Jerry, do you want to do you have a slide on the WHO statements?
Okay, according to the WHO, then the other medicines that some people try to use, so ivermectin is not recommended for non-severe COVID. It is not recommended for severe COVID. And the other medicine, hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, is not recommended in non-severe cases or severe cases of COVID-19.
So the WHO currently say that the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, do not prevent you from developing COVID. They do not stop transmission, but they may reduce the severity
Severity.
of the impacts. And
And
the other
the
thing is
emphasis
that
is on may.
there are rare adverse events that can occur, and they mention myocarditis as an example. And the reason that I'm saying all of this is because YouTube's community guidelines do not allow you to talk about actual science uh, that disagrees with what the WHO is saying on the vaccines or whatever. And if they do, so we have to stress that. Um, because we're on YouTube. But if you want to find the actual science, do read in the paper. In the paper, we discuss what the latest science, what is currently known about the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, and also about ivermectin, HCQ versus remdesivir. So we give things on that. So, okay,
All right, over to you,
yeah,
Jerry.
Okay,
Wrap it up.
okay. So let's get in. You've given some of the secrets away, but never mind. The four main points of the manuscript are: one, the over reliance on mathematical models for making policy;
yeah,
two, it leads into point two, which is the non-pharmaceutical interventions, i.e., government interventions that weren't based on a medicine or a treatment, something like masks or lockdowns, which were also based on models. Then these weren't effectively assessed enough. Three, the unequal treatment of proposed or repurposed medicines,
Yeah.
which were proposed early in the pandemic. The treatment of those compared to the new vaccine technology, and I just want to add at this point that you can see in this chart that not all of the vaccines were made in the new technology way, i.e., involving DNA or RNA technology. Some of them were made in the traditional style by the Indians and the Chinese. And the last part of the manuscript will cover the unequal treatment of scientific voices
Yeah.
by the media and,
Yeah.
and social media. So if we come to the first point, which I think Ronan discussed, and you could probably expand on it, was the
Yeah.
use of mathematical models
Yeah.
to create government policy. And we said earlier on, we said Ronan, I think Ronan said that they might have been mathematical models and statisticians, but they didn't know anything about biology, immunology, or
Epidemiology.
virology because the assumptions they entered into the models didn't make any sense, like no seasons.
Yeah.
The young have the same predisposition as the old people.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
young people move around and have the same amount of contacts as the old people. So these weren't based on any kind of these were based on more of a computer thought of what a human unit is. And
Yeah.
that's not how biology operates. What do you think, Ronan?
Yeah, no, no, that's it exactly. And then the what you were saying about the seasonality, we document a few cases where people were using this SEER model and trying to incorporate seasonality, but the vast majority of them and the ones that were advising most governments did not include them. So literally, they if you ran the model, it would give you the same result whether the pandemic started in January or in July. They just did number of days since outbreak began. That's the
And,
way the
and,
models did it.
and the other thing we showed in that paper was that when they introduced the lockdowns,
Yeah,
It's the
the
same point.
it was already declining. The outbreak was
yes,
already declining.
Yeah, we mentioned that
According to
before
the
about
season.
the
Yeah. Mhm.
we mentioned that before of the Wood paper
yeah,
published, first investigated in 2020. And
yeah,
then Simon Wood actually puts something at the end of one of his papers and tells of his struggle to get this data published. It
yeah,
took a year later and many, many concessions to the journal before he could even state that actually the decline in cases started well before the government lockdown. Because maybe somebody didn't want him to say that at that time,
yeah.
But
And
and
some of us, a few of our colleagues wrote about had papers as well like that, like even Boudreau et al. With Colleen and Paul.
Benny Spira, no,
Benny Spira, and then also um, the we had like Savaris. He also,
Tavares,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
there was quite a few people. A
He,
lot.
he had a very hard time trying to publish some of his research.
Yeah, and so people would go and they would say, they point this out. This was a problem. You would hear, we're following the science. Governments would say, we're following the science. But if you were a scientist like we were, that was saying, hey, have you heard of this type of science? Then you were silenced, you were censored, you were shut down. And then if you did get a voice, if you did actually manage to get some attention to your findings, then you were often got like fact checkers, or then people would retract there would be pressure put on the journals to get your paper retracted. And there was, I think, another example that's worth mentioning for um, there was just a Great Barrington Declaration was published in October 2020, and that was uh, after a nearly a year of lockdown measures and mask mandates and all of that, the three lead epidemiologists and researchers from, I think one was from Oxford, Dr. Sunetra Gupta from Oxford. You had,
Harvard and
yes,
Yale,
um,
Woodrow, yeah.
and then from Stanford. And
Jay
Stanford. Sorry.
Bhattacharya, yeah.
yes, and they were pointing out, because there was the distinct risk profile, that maybe society should rethink and try and do a more focused protection policy. So instead of keeping the entire population, for kids to elderly, under lockdowns and different restrictions, to try and develop more strategic ones to protect the elderly and the at-risk people. And they were shut down immediately. I remember trying to sign on to their thing and googling the.
Yeah, and don't forget being called fringe. We don't fringe
Well, I was
science.
just going to get to that. But like the week of the Great Barrington Declaration, I was looking for the website to see what they were saying, and I had to go to like the third page of Google search results, because all of them were hit pieces that had just been put out. So there was some coordination with Google to downrank the actual links to the Great Barrington Declaration's website and anything promoting it in favor of it took a couple of weeks
Yeah, I
before
mean,
finally
there,
they
there
did
there
that.
was the John Snow Declaration, which was really just a takedown of the Great Barrington
Yes,
Declaration.
Yeah.
But I actually, because I talk to a lot of ordinary people,
yeah,
and I want to actually put the other side of the argument that the other people have put to me, that it was an emergency and we had to do it.
yeah,
It's me. But my usual reply is, but then you had all the data and you repeated the same mistake, and that's actually what happened. They
yeah,
had the data from the first wave, and they said, "Oh, let's do this again," and
yeah,
and there was nothing behind it to back it up. They were experimental, and there was no rationale for it. Or they may have invented some kind of rationale, but once the data were in, there was no actual proof. There was no rechecking. Did these? I mean, we actually published a manuscript before that of the inadvertent consequences of
Mhm.
non-pharmaceutical interventions, which showed that not even they did not do anything; they were causing harm in some cases.
yeah,
And our seasonality paper also, we investigated non-pharmaceutical interventions in the Northern Hemisphere, and we saw that just seasonality had more effect than any government intervention and any campaign of vaccination.
yeah,
So you're coming to the fourth point, which was who controlled the narrative, who was
yeah,
controlling the narrative, and that's our fourth point. So we made, sorry, we made a list of suggestions, so I can see if I can find them.
yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, that models should never replace empirical analysis.
Okay,
Once empirical data is in, it shouldn't be replaced by more models.
yeah,
Okay. Number two, the NPIs, or non-pharmaceutical interventions, require holistic health impact assessments. Okay,
yeah,
so everything should be assessed from economic consequences to health consequences. And this leads into the third point that we make: that research into repurposed medicines should be encouraged and not dismissed outright. Okay, and that leads into the next point: that new technology should always be critically evaluated. There was more emphasis placed on criticizing the old repurposed drugs that were on the market for 40 years
yeah.
rather than
Biomarking, hedging.
the latest technology.
It's
Okay.
mRNA and DNA approach.
Yes, yes, not the traditional vaccines, but the new genetic type vaccines. And
Yeah,
also, and what was very concerning during the pandemic is consent should be voluntary.
Yeah, consent.
There was
Big issue.
many court cases where people were trying to have people vaccinated without consent, and forcing people into that, given coerced consent.
yeah,
That's not consent if it's coerced. Which leads us. to point six. Okay. It's important that the primary decision of healthcare is between the physician and the patient. So
Yeah.
that's maybe more a point of Ronan's.
Yeah.
Okay. And point seven, to the censorship of ideas, the best
Oh yeah.
antidote to bad ideas is better ideas.
Yeah.
Censorship only leads to weaker scientific conclusions. Scientific freedom should be cherished.
Yeah. Okay. So
Good
that's
point.
good summary, and I think we did
I
this.
just,
We
I,
could.
can I just say something
Yeah.
to that
Please.
point,
Yeah.
to the final point? Because people didn't know about the nature of the new medicines, they couldn't give informed consent because they didn't really know the whole details of what adverse effects, and the reason they didn't know the adverse effects is because it wasn't published,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
it was trickling out, and they were
Yeah.
suppressing it. But the government should have just been honest and says we also have reservations about, maybe, but the mere fact that they forced half of the Western world to take one particular remedy rather than the Chinese one or the Indian one,
Yeah.
that is an ethical problem. Is definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's worth any time for Ronan or Jerry to explain in details, especially a few of those papers who publish papers in high-profile journal, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, claiming that the vaccine, the jabs, are safe and effective. But
Yeah.
it's all trickeries, it's all numbers, statistics.
Yeah. It's so
I
I
think it's
I
worthwhile for people to hear, especially when they don't deal with science.
Yeah, so we, as I said before, we have to be very careful about what we say because we're on YouTube, and that should make people wonder why are scientists afraid to say what we're doing. But for detailed, you can look into the paper.
Paper,
But
yeah.
what I can say is there was a couple of studies. Some people will hear of this Watson et al. Was a 2023 study, and there's a couple like it.
20 was it not 2022? The Watson
Yeah,
study.
with 2022. That's
Yeah.
right. They claimed that the vaccination programs had saved, what was it, 19 million lives?
19 million.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so people, that sounds impressive. And when you say, "Wow, that's really amazing," that's proof. But it's like, what was the proof? Well, what the proof was is they did what's called a counterfactual scenario. So basically, they got the model that we talked about and that we criticize in the paper. We point out limitations and that is simplifications in it. But the model, they would run it and they would say, what do we expect will happen without vaccination? And then they expected there'd be 19 million uh, deaths. And, and there would be lots of deaths. I think that an extra
19 million more
more
deaths.
deaths
No,
Yeah.
and then actually occurred. But they made a prediction that was off by 19 million, and so they said, well, that must be because we vaccinated, and so they said the vaccines saved 19 million, but that
But, but in
relative
fact, if you look back to the previous time when the models were coming out initially,
yeah,
uh, they were showing that they were predicting huge amounts, and that was before the vaccine ever
yeah.
occurred. So we had already got evidence to show that the models were overestimating what was going to happen.
And then the other thing, the same thing applies with the various non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs. That's like everything from the school closures, the stay-at-home measures, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, the mask, as all of those things that didn't involve a vaccine or a medical treatment or a pharmaceutical treatment. Those they use the same counterfactual scenario for concluding that the lockdowns and all of these measures worked. What they would do is they would run, this is what we expect will happen to the pandemic. We will get this one massive wave that will have 80% of the population, different 70 to 90%, will be gets COVID within within a couple of months, and
Mm-hmm.
that up to 15-20% will be in hospital at the same time. And they, if that were true, if that did happen, it would have been devastating. So they had all of the governments were being shown this. This is what will happen if you don't urgently do something, and then they implemented all of these unprecedented measures, and then it didn't happen, and so they said, well, it must be that it worked. There was nobody was saying, well,
Yeah.
there was a lot were saying maybe the models were wrong, and
Right.
then in fact people were pointing out, say Sweden did an example. They showed they
Didn't lock
they
down.
they were mainly relying on voluntary restrictions, which, according to say the Imperial College London, they had done a specific prediction of the deaths that would occur, and it was like they were predicting like 40,000 deaths by the end of the year, and in total there was like only, if they did what they did, there was in total like 5,000 deaths, and 80%, 70% of them were in elderly healthcare, in nursing homes, or in healthcare facilities, or stay-at-home facilities. So it was not across the whole population as the model had predicted. It was it was mostly the elderly. And we saw one paper, it said that they had probably an average lifespan remaining of maybe like another, if they didn't catch COVID, they might have had an average of maybe another 6 months. That was one study by that was looking at with the average lifespan. But so you had all of these different things, and but then people that were like Simon Wood, or Savaris, or the different ones were some of our co-authors, and others that were, they all were finding, anyone that actually looked and compared the measures that were implemented in different countries or regions and the outcomes, they were not finding anything. Like, for instance, I think famously, I think it was North Dakota and South Dakota had very different implementations because they had different governors. That one of them was stricter and was enforcing more mask mandates, etc. And they had almost identical um, outcomes for the first year, despite very different restrictions. And I think we've been talking for a good bit.
Yeah.
I'd say we could probably,
Wrap it up. But there's one more
Just,
phenomenon.
just,
Since we
the,
are talking
just the
about
one thing.
yeah.
Just,
What
just
really? What
one
really?
thing. There were media reports that some government advisors were given the worst case scenarios,
Yeah,
and that the government only accepted the worst case scenario because that made the number of lives look saved look a lot larger.
not
And if
long.
they had went, even the least worst case scenario was a way out of was way over predicted.
yeah. And we discuss all of this in the paper as well. And Willie,
But
you
another
want?
phenomenon, just to close it up, is in the sense that we have seen it obviously from coming from climate area, we have seen it. But in this particular COVID situation, it's very ugly. It's about bad paper, I mean, like the one you mentioned being promoted, but the good paper got retracted after being published. I mean,
Yeah,
that's another one of those very strange utopian crazy Orwell
yeah,
stuff that
yeah, yeah.
it's very difficult to explain. Let's hope not to repeat it again.
Yes, so I think we could talk about each individual section in the paper for probably an entire
Yeah, yeah,
podcast
yeah. Just
episode.
ask people
Uh,
to, the bottom line is to read it.
yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll include the links
For
to
a
the
week. Yeah.
we'll include the links to the papers, and we'd encourage you to actually just read it and share it. Share this video if you think it helps to just this overview, and spread the word. Tell everybody to have a look. And we mentioned this quote, this internet quote, which is anonymous. Some people say Feynman, but it said, "I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned.
Right.
And so if you agree with that, there's a lot of answers that cannot be questioned that we are questioning in this paper. And we are giving some answers as well. So so should we leave it at that? Any
I think
final
so.
comments?
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you,
Right,
Ron.
right.
Thank you.
Okay,
No,
thank you.
good,
So
good.
take care.